Islamic mysticism, Sohrawardi, not in the sense that this is the only possibility of declination of this subject in dialogue with other philosophical or spiritual perspectives, but because I have the honor of speaking here in Tehran, and I wish to show you my gratefulness for this possibility of dialogue with your cultural and spiritual tradition. And another little remark, I will use okay. I will use the formulation Persian or Iranian Platonism, but not in a philological sense and signification, only in order to signify a continuity with the horizon of Platonic tradition to which I'm going to point. Thank you. Yeah, good. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry. The current representation of our phenomenal self corresponds to the characterization of the self given by Ludwig Wittgenstein with regard to the perspective of solipsism. In fact, currently we represent ourselves like a point contracted in itself without extension and obscure, not constituting a part, but establishing a limit with respect to the world and to other selves. If taken seriously, this atomistic representation would actually imply the impossibility of any dialogical encounter. It would namely reduce the life of the self to a mere reflection of its interiority, excluding the capability of perception relating to the interiority of another self. In my contribution, I wish to stimulate your attention towards metaphysics of light as providing a relevant opportunity of abandoning the aforesaid anti-dialogical representation of the self, on the basis of which any intercultural and interreligious encounter would be definitely hindered. As we shall see, the viewpoint of metaphysics of light could encourage a fruitful openness towards understanding diverse cultural and religious perspectives, since it offers a conceptual paradigm of self which radically transcends the above evidenced atomistic representation, identifying our true self not with an obscure point, but with a center of spiritual light, opening for other center of spiritual light, an infinite space of manifestation. I decided to concentrate on metaphysics of light also because its attitude profoundly pervades and partially still pervades Eastern as well as Western philosophies and theologies or mystic perspectives, building a shared philosophical perspective which has made and could still make possible a fruitful cultural and interreligious encounter. This perspective manifests itself exemplarily in Plato's analogy between the supreme good, that is the divine origin or every being, and the sun in Plato's Politeia Republic, which analogy both Eastern and Western Platonists regards as an indispensable guide for experiencing and exploring the nature, the essence of being. According to this analogy, the authenticity of every being has to be perceived as a manifestation of intelligible, that is, spiritual light. The highest good, that is the supreme divine reality, perceived by Plato as unconditional self-givingness and generativity, generates intelligible light as consisting in an instant and eternal unity of self-conscious intelligence, that is, unlimited self-transparency, and intelligible being, that is, eminently generative and therefore unconditional luminous being. Plato points to this infinitely luminous and generative unity, which constitutes the essence, the authenticity of every spiritual, intelligible self and individuality, of every nous, we could say. In Plato's perspective, the authenticity of human self is in turn to be perceived as residing exactly in the conscious experience and manifestation of this intelligible unity. That is, in experiencing oneself as intelligible, luminous, and generative self. That is, as an authentically good self. In this perspective, the human self is namely, in its most profound truth, a spiritual, luminous individuality, a center of spiritual light, consisting in a non-localizable, immaterial, and intelligible reality, which transcends any physical and psychological phenomenon. And now I will focus on the philosophy of Plotinus, because basing on the imagery derived from Plato's analogy between the good and the sun, Plotinus does in fact offer one of the most interesting characterizations concerning intelligible reality, of which reality, the truth of the human self, has to be regarded as a veritable manifestation. The here intended characterization is provided in Aeneas 5:8, 4, line 4 to 11, where Plotinus explicates the eminently generative unity of being and consciousness pervading the intelligible world, the spiritual world, identifying this unity with the self-transparency of intelligible light. In the just mentioned passage, Plotinus represents intelligible life as a condition of complete reciprocal transparency, which instantly generates a plural unity among all intelligible beings. Hence, in intelligible life, every being is for every being, and all beings are for every being completely transparent, so that every being generatively encompasses every being in the full consciousness of its own self, and contemplates all beings through all beings. As a consequence, intelligible selves are to be perceived as eminently relational, that is, as generative selves, comparable to points of intelligible light, building a sphere transcending space and time. See, for example, chapter 9 in Aeneas 5:8. In this sphere of intelligible light, through manifesting itself, every component of the sphere immediately does manifest the center, every other component, as well as the totality of the sphere. The intelligible components of this sphere of light, in fact, cannot be considered as separated from each other through the presence of something residing between them. Therefore, every point building the circumference is not separated from the center, so that every point belonging to the circumference is center, and the whole sphere is constituted only by the points building its circumference. The center is everywhere, that is, every point is center, and the circumference is non-localizable. But the hereby presupposed unity of the original center with every other point of the sphere is not to be intended as a static mathematical coincidence, which would imply a spatial connotation of it, that is the absorption and annihilation of all components through the center. On the contrary, this unity has to be perceived as dynamic reciprocal transparency, which instantly connects each other, all components of the sphere. The resultant relation subsisting among those components, that is, among the intelligible beings, can be therefore imagined as rhythm and harmony, or like an eternal pulsation, through which every component, by manifesting its self-consciousness, immediately manifests the self-conscious transparency of every other component. In other words, the image of the sphere of intelligible light shows that through manifesting their own individuality, intelligible or spiritual selves manifest unconditional openness to alterity, that is, to the unconditional manifestation of other individualities, building thus the paradigm of every authentic dialogical attitude. Commensurate with the just characterized reciprocal transparency, the essence and life of every intelligible being, of every spiritual self, consists, in fact, not only in a perfect consciousness of its own self, but also in the unconditional impulse to make apparent the whole transparency of its own self to other beings capable of perceiving this self and its transparency. Accordingly, every intelligible self consists in instantly and entirely revealing its own interiority to another self, so that intelligible life transcends any separation between exteriority and interiority. In accordance with these premises, an intelligible self can be regarded as an instantiation of unconditional dialogicity. This intrinsic dialogical character of intelligible beings can explain why Plotinus in Aeneas 15 compares the intelligible world to a radiating being wholly constituted of living faces. The notion of face seems namely to denote the impulse of communicating its own interiority, which characterizes the life of intelligible selves. This manifests intelligible life as instant, eternal, and generative encounter of spiritual or intelligible selves, willing each self instantly comprehend and generatively manifest each other. In other words, the notion of face represents here an immediate, generative and dynamic unity of interiority and exteriority. In conformity with the just delineated perspective, intelligible life cannot be perceived as corresponding to any form of static, as I said, ontology. Intelligible being is namely an inseparable, dynamic and generative unity of identity and otherness or alterity. Plotinus stresses this fact in Aeneas 6, 7, 13 and 14. Of interiority and exteriority. For this reason, the identity and individuality of every intelligible being thus consist in the manifestation of an alterity, which by manifesting its own transparency, thus manifests the whole transparency of that individuality. More precisely, the individuality and self-consciousness of an intelligible self is characterized, as already evidenced, by unconditional relationality and communicativeness. In an intelligible being, consciousness, transparency of its own self, excludes, therefore, any possibility of solipsism, as this consciousness consists in a generative actuality which instantly makes possible the manifestation of other intelligible selves, simultaneously co-generating, together with its own consciousness, the consciousness of other selves. Of this generative self-transparency, the phenomenal self-awareness, self-consciousness, self-transparency and comprehension of the human self has to be assumed as a veritable image, attesting the original intelligible or spiritual and luminous character of the human self. In Plotinus' work, this assumption is not explicit, but has to be expected in the context of the metaphysics presupposed by Plotinus. In this context, with respect to the human self, self-transparency can be namely regarded as instantiating the intelligible unity of identity and otherness, whereas identity and otherness are in this case immediately manifest only for the self which experiences its own transparency, not manifesting at first any other self. We are speaking now of, I've spoken now only of phenomenal self. The explicit and systematic assumption of self-transparency and self-consciousness as manifesting the spiritual character of human self may be considered an original peculiarity of Persian Platonism, or Iranian Platonism, which, basing on premises derived from Ibn Sina, finds a paradigmatic expression in Suhrawardi's characterization of self-consciousness. Although I am not a specialist in this field, at this point I would like to focus on this characterization of Suhrawardi, since it can offer important suggestions concerning the discussed subject. In his Hikmat al-Ishraq, Suhrawardi affirms that every being for which the own self is immediately manifest, that is, every being capable of grasping its own self, is constituted of immaterial spiritual light. And exactly this peculiarity characterizes the human self. The human self, the I, namely does not apprehend itself through an image of itself. That image would in fact be different from it, which would involve that the self-knowledge of the self would consist in the knowledge of something other. In this case, the I would not apprehend the aforesaid image as I, but it would grasp it as an object in the third-person perspective. As a consequence, the self and the act of its self-apprehension cannot be separated. In other words, in order to grasp ourself, we need exclusively ourself, that is, its self-generative activity, beyond any relation to any substantiality or quality. And with respect to this peculiarity, we are consonant with every being capable of grasping its own self, that is, with every spiritual being. According to Suhrawardi, the peculiarity of being self-manifest, that is, of self-transparency and self-perception, has no relation to the quality of thingness. The self-transparent self has no other specificity than being immediate, instant self-manifestedness. That is, its being consists in intelligible light. In turn, intelligible light is self-manifestedness, which instantly makes another being manifest. For this reason, in this perspective, the experience of phenomenal self-consciousness cannot assume any solipsistic implications. On the contrary, being evidence of an intelligible reality, the active and generative self-transparency of human self manifests itself both as necessary premise and as paradigm of every act which leads to the comprehension of other beings. That is, as paradigm of any authentically dialogical act. In this perspective, any act of perception leading to comprehension, that is, any encounter with an individual being which leads to its comprehension, has in fact to be regarded as an approximation to the self-manifestedness of intelligible light and intelligible selves, since the realization of the related perceiving act does not involve any mediation through mental representation. Perception and comprehension of individual beings can namely happen only insofar as the perceived being is capable of generating an unveiled presence in its relation to the percipient. Accordingly, a perception leading to comprehension bases on reciprocal openness and manifestedness of the perceiving and perceived beings, constituting an image of the attitude in which the life of intelligible beings or spiritual beings consists. In consonance with this perspective opened by both Plotinus and Sohrawardi, the encounter between two or more human selves contains the potentiality of generating a faithful and fruitful image of spiritual life. In the act of reciprocal comprehension, two or more human selves, in fact, actualize not only their self-transparency, but also a relation which recalls the sphere of spiritual light to which Plotinus refers. How much time do I need? Five minutes. Okay. No objection is capable of obliterating the phenomenal experience we can observe in association with any act of reciprocal comprehension. On the one hand, we would perceive and comprehend no really other self if we would not generate an unlimited space of manifestation for its individuality, that is, if we would not be unconditionally open for its transparency. On the other hand, no perception and comprehension would be possible if other selves would not be open for being comprehended by us. This points to a real, potentially infinite self-givingness, which, besides self-transparency, characterizes ourself and the other human selves, being capable of connecting ourself with ourselves. Without the here intended self-givingness, I would namely remain confined in my interiority, and the other selves in their exteriority. Were myself, as well as every other human self, incapable of manifesting at least a certain level of unconditional self-givingness, no form of real comprehension would be possible. In other words, the act and the instant of comprehension between human selves transcend the current separation between interiority and exteriority, so that the involved selves cannot be represented as atomistic obscure points. On the contrary, they have to be represented as centers of intelligible light, of spiritual light, transcending the dimension of body and psychological phenomena, like components of a sphere constituted by intelligible light. This representation is namely incommensurably more consequent with the act of comprehending each other than the current atomistic representation of ourselves. Since I wish to gain time, I exclude from my paper the discussion of eliminativist positions concerning the self. If you have questions about the possibility of justifying my position with respect to eliminativism or reductionism, please ask during the discussion. I will now conclude in order that we can be again on time. My attempt consists in pointing to a metaphysics of light as a possibility of transforming our representation of human self from the atomistic modality to which Wittgenstein points to an eminently dialogical modality which would correspond to the image of the sphere constituted of spiritual or intelligible light. This modality is, according to my perception, much more in consonance with the phenomenal experience of comprehending other selves and the world. And that's why I think it could be very interesting to consider it more consequently than till now, in order to give to the experience of dialogue a more reliable foundation than exactly the representation of the self as an obscure and self-referential point. And I think through this representation of self as a center of spiritual light, it would be possible to unite in a dialogue many traditions of East and West, both in philosophical and in theological field, and that's why I wished to point your attention to this possibility. Thank you very much.